Good afternoon and welcome to the third Anglo-American Romanticism seminar series, Rise, Assert Thy Right, Women in the Romantic Period. First of all, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the institutions, research groups, companies, and people that have made this seminar possible. Above all, to the University of La Rioja, and particularly to Vicerrectorado de Estudiantes, Escuela de Máster y Doctorado, Departamento de Filologías Modernas, through the Seminario Permanente Carmelo Punchillos, GREED Research Group, especially to one of its members, Jonathan Gonzalez, who was of great help during the first stages in this project. I cannot forget to mention the Servicio de Relaciones Institucionales y Comunicación, Rubén, Eugenio, Sergio, always so patient, supportive, and helpful. Our thanks as well to Libro Project, Hispanic Literature in the British Periodical Press, funded by the Spanish Ministry of Science, Innovation and Universities. And thanks as well to the book-selling company, Santos Ochoa, which has also collaborated in the organization of this digital event. Special thanks are due to the speakers, leading scholars who kindly and generously accepted the invitation to participate and share their extensive knowledge on the matter with us in this seminar. Diego Saglia, Sara Medina Calzada, María Jesús Lorenzo Modia, Begoña Lasa Álvarez, Beatriz González Moreno, Fernando González Moreno. And of course, thanks to all of you who are watching us through the YouTube channel of the University of La Rioja. You all together have made this third seminar on Romanticism possible. After a first seminar devoted to the analysis of Frankenstein, and a second one in which we explored Edgar Allan Poe's works, the present seminar is focused on women in the Romantic period. The British Romantic period, whose chronological limits are generally located between the 1790s and 1830s, roughly speaking, is usually identified with the so-called Big Six male poets, Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, Shelley, and Byron. To these, some other male authors such as Robert Southey, Hazlitt were progressively added by scholars to construct the core of the Romantic movement in Great Britain. Therefore, the very same concept of Romanticism was shaped in relation to these authors and their concerns and literary outputs. It was formulated mainly from a masculine point of view. Before the 1980s, 1990s, the study of British Romanticism did not consider many or almost any women writer. But the truth is that this period was a turning point in British women's writing. More women than ever were trying to make a living by writing. As an example, between 1770 and 1830, there were at least 500 women publishing poetry. For the first time in history, there was a generation of female professional writers. They were deeply engaged in contemporary intellectual, political, and social debates, and they took an active role by taking the pen and publishing their works. Luckily, the long-standing scholarly neglect of women writers in the Romantic period is something of the past, and I will give you a couple of examples. A good case in point is the following. The most authoritative anthology of Romantic poetry is probably Duncan Wood's Romanticism, an anthology published in 1994. Well, this anthology included the work of some female writers. They are not absent. I mean, there are a few, though the male poets greatly outnumbered the female ones. Then 3 years later, Wood published his anthology of Romantic women poets that was designed as a companion to his first anthology and was dedicated exclusively to female poets of the Romantic period. He understood this volume as the logical conclusion to the former. He claimed, ideally, I hope that readers will use the two volumes together. Well, to me, ideally, they both should be combined into just one volume entitled just Romantic Poetry. And well, there was still some work to be done, but it was a good starting point. This volume featured a selection of works of a long list of women poets, as you can see on the screen. Well, just to mention a few, Barbauld, Lady Caroline Lamb, Anne Radcliffe, Charlotte Smith, Mary Robinson, and many others, as you can see there. Well, up to now, I've been talking about female poets, but women writing was not limited at all to verse, as the Cambridge Companion to Women's Writing in the Romantic Period testifies. Well, you are nobody in the literary canon if you haven't got your own Cambridge Companion. So it was a step forward. It was published not long ago, in 2015, just 6 years ago, but it explores the variety of literary genres in women's production, because they apart from poetry, they also wrote fiction, drama, travel writing, histories, essays, political writing. Women were particularly prolific in fiction. They were not only the primary consumers, readers, they were indeed. And in this sense, the role of the circulating or lending libraries was instrumental. Well, as you can see in this image. But they were not only passive readers, they were also the primary producers of novels. The novel market was dominated by women novelists such as Maria Edgeworth, Amelia Opie, Jane Austen, Frances Burney. The main objective of this seminar is to contribute to the reassessment of women writing during the Romantic period. We want to draw the attention to their work and make it more visible to a wider audience. But then it comes a question. What is a romantic woman writer? Lucy poses this question. What is a romantic woman writer? Do we consider a woman writer to belong to the Romantic period if she died in the early 1790s, or if she didn't start publishing until the late 1830s? Do her birth and death dates matter most, or is it the dates of her published works, or might it be some other qualities of her career or writings that lead us to describe her as romantic? Placing women writers in the traditional literary categories of 18th century, Romantic, 19th century, or Victorian literature is definitely not an exact science. Lives and careers are rarely so neat. Well, this question will be addressed and will be discussed in more detail in one of the sessions. In this seminar, we're going to deal with both women writers who lived and published within the chronological limits of the Romantic period, but also with those whose works were so much permeated with the Romantic features that even though they are usually encapsulated within the label of Victorian writers or 18th century women writers, they may also be described as romantic. This is the case, for instance, of the Brontë sisters. Hence, our speakers will explore the works of some major Romantic women writers. My big six female Romantic authors. Authors such as Jane Austen, author of the well-known novels Pride and Prejudice or Sense and Sensibility, or Mary Shelley, the mother of the universal masterpiece Frankenstein. Mary Wollstonecraft, the grandmother of Frankenstein. She was Shelley's mother. And she was also the author of the groundbreaking Vindications for the Rights of Women, considered by many the first work of feminist philosophy. These sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, who first published their works under the names of Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell, since they had, I quote, the vague impression that authoresses were liable to be looked on with prejudice. Well, they became later cultural icons, and in the process of becoming a myth, their gender played an important role, as we will also see in one of the sessions today. The works of these six women writers are milestones in the history of British literature, and even today, some of them are bestsellers. As a curiosity, and according to a survey that was conducted by The Guardian a couple of years ago, some of their novels are in the top 20 of the greatest love stories ever. Well, if you have a look at them, you'll see that the first position is for Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. The second, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. The third is Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare, but who's that? Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë, and then in the 14th position, Sense and Sensibility, again by Jane Austen, and in the 18th, Persuasion by Jane Austen again. So, well, as you can see, they are still today bestsellers. But in our seminar, there will also be some room for less known authors, such as Maria Edgeworth, or Lady Morgan, or Mary Brontë, or Felicia Hemans, who, curiously enough, was one of the most widely read poets of the 19th century and was admired by Byron, Shelley, Wordsworth, but she was forgotten by scholarship during most of the 20th century. Attention will also be paid in our seminar to all those minor authors who published their works in William Lane's Minerva Press, which issued a huge number of new novels. I think that approximately 800 new novels, mainly Gothic novels written by women. And finally, we will move from words to images, or rather, we will read words and images together, since it is also the purpose of this seminar to explore the different representations or portrayals of women in the illustrations that went with or that accompanying some literary annuals and works. The program consists of 6 sessions. 3 will take place today and 3 more tomorrow, Friday. Each of the conferences will take approximately 40 minutes, so that there is some spare time for questions and discussion at the end. And there will be, I hope, some time for a short break between each session. Please feel free to write your question in the YouTube chat. You can write your questions in English, but you can also write them in Spanish. También podéis escribirlas en castellano, si queréis. Well, we hope you find the conferences of interest. We aim at providing a more comprehensive view of the Romantic period in which women had a pivotal role. And I think that I am just in time to introduce you to our first speaker. Let me see if I can stop sharing.
I'm here. Hello.
Hi, Diego. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to see you here. Okay, let me introduce you to those who don't know Diego Salia. He's a wonderful scholar, a wonderful person. He's professor of English literature at the University of Parma, Italy. And his research focuses on the literature of the Romantic period, in particular on Orientalism, the Gothic, national identity, and gender. He has worked and published extensively on central figures such as Jane Austen, Felicia Hemans, Byron, Robert Southey, and Walter Scott. A good part of his research concerns Anglo-Hispanic relations in Romantic period literature and culture. And in this field, he has published a monograph entitled Poetic Castles in Spain, British Romanticism and Figurations of Iberia, which is a groundbreaking work. And he has also co-edited with Ian Haywood a volume of essays, Spain and British Romanticism. He's a member of the steering committee of the Anglo-Hispanic Horizons Research Group and sits on the advisory committee of the Byron Museum in Ravenna, Italy. And his latest publication is European Literatures in Britain, Romantic Translations. And he's going to help us read deep in Jane Austen. Thank you, Diego, so much.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you, everyone, for being here. It is my pleasure to have been able to accept the invitation. Obviously, the pleasure would have been the greater. I won't be the first person to say this today, but having been all together, being able to enjoy our company in person would have been so much better. But times are what they are, and we have to sort of face the situation and make the most of it. And hopefully I'll live up to this very generous presentation. Yes, before I start sharing my screen and showing you my slides, Christina, you said that the aim of this conference is to draw attention to Romantic period women writers and to make them visible again. Well, that is not exactly the case of someone like Jane Austen. However, in specific ways that can help us understand her differently or more precisely. So this is a bit like my challenge for today. Let's see if the challenge works. So I will now share my presentation with you. You should be able to see it now. Perfect, thank you. Right. So, reading in Jane Austen, reading Jane Austen. Now, let's start with a couple of questions. Who was Jane Austen? Which may sound silly, but I hope that it will turn out to be not so silly after a while. Who was Jane Austen, and what did she look like? We know very little about Jane Austen. She is such a famous writer, but we don't have a lot of specific information about her. We have very few sources. Just think that most of the letters that she wrote were destroyed. We only have a little over 160 letters extant that still exist, although she may have written something like 3,000 letters. A lot of them were destroyed by her sister Cassandra, who was her executor after her death. When most people think about Jane Austen and try to visualize her, this is possibly the image or a version of this image that most immediately comes to mind. A sweet and lovely youngish woman. This is a Victorian image. This is not an image from when she was alive. A later image from a time that was reinterpreting Austen according to its schemes, its norms, its principles. It has become the standard image. For instance, if you have in your hands one of the new £10 notes, you will find a picture of Jane Austen, which re-elaborates that Victorian image. A prettified, a sweetened Austen. But look at the original, look at the basis, let's say, of this image. It's a sketch by her sister Cassandra, taken around 1810. And here Jane Austen is not so pretty. She actually looks, well, she has a pinched face. This very important nose, I think we would say nowadays. She has a severe look on her face. She's arch looking. She looks arch, we would say in English. And she looks like not so much a sweet woman, but as a very sharp, observant woman. So, first of all, do we really know what Austen looked like if we have that Victorian image in mind? This is one of two images that we have that were taken during her lifetime. The second one is the following. It's even more enigmatic. This is a watercolor by her sister, Cassandra Austen. And why is it even more enigmatic? Now we've got Austen turning her back on us. So these two pictures, I wanted to start from these two pictures because they introduce us directly to the problem of understanding Austen and reading Austen. She is very, very elusive. So, Jane Austen, is she an easy or a difficult author to read? Since we only know Austen partially, we have very few letters, for instance, can we really know her fiction? If we have such few documents about her, can we really say that we can penetrate her fiction successfully? Do we know how to read her as an author and as a woman and her fiction? Now, these doubts are justified. In one of the earliest biographical documents we have, James Edward Austen Lee's A Memoir of Jane Austen, that was published in 1870. This descendant of the author wrote, "I doubt whether it would be possible to mention any other author of note whose personal obscurity was so complete." Here, her descendant stresses our lack of solid facts, our lack of evidence because of her obscurity, because she didn't live a glamorous, visible life, that of a celebrity like Lord Byron. But these words also point to the fact that Austen is, being in obscurity, she is deceivingly transparent. So we may think that she is easy to understand, easy to read, easy to interpret, but in fact, this is a deceiving transparency. Something that Virginia Woolf in 1924 pointed out when she said, famously, "Of all great writers, she's the most difficult to catch in the act of greatness." This is to say, yes, Jane Austen was great, but what makes her great? I will rephrase this. How do we have to read Jane Austen in order to actually, let's say, put our finger on the point or points of greatness? Now, if we look at her letters, we understand that Jane Austen was playing games with her readers, and she's playing games with us as well. She wanted to be difficult to read. She wanted to be unpredictable. For instance, in a letter to Cassandra of 1813, she writes, she's here parodying a couple of lines by Walter Scott, and she writes, "I do not write for such dull elves, silly, stupid, as have not a great deal of ingenuity themselves." She wants us, she writes for ingenious readers. I don't mean ingenuous, I mean ingenious. Readers who are sharp, who know how to, let's say, capture details, nuances. Then she also writes in another letter, again 1813, "If I am a wild beast, I cannot help it. It is not my own fault." So she doesn't present herself as a sweet lady, as, let's say, a writer who doesn't want to challenge us. She presents herself as a wild beast from the point of view of humor or irony, or looking at, let's say, the darker sides of reality. Very, very different from that prettified image that we saw at the start. In another letter, she writes, these are all very famous quotations, "Pictures of perfection, as you know, make me sick and wicked." She presents herself as wicked, which we could paraphrase as rebellious, irreverent. And I have put there a reference to an essay that in 1940, so a long time ago, threw light on this particular aspect of Jane Austen's, let's say, aesthetics. Look at this from her letters. This is an example of her verbal wildness, of how disobedient she was, and she could be in her letters. For instance, writing privately to her sister Cassandra. Again, Cassandra is away, so Jane is writing to her and says, "I have unpacked the gloves and placed yours in your drawer. Their colour is light and pretty, and I believe exactly what we fixed on." This is very much the case with Jane Austen's letters, where she tends to, let's say, provide her sister or her other relatives and correspondents with lists of daily events, quotidian occurrences, household life. And then anecdotes, such as the following one. "Mrs. Hall of Sherborne was brought to bed yesterday of a dead child." So she's talking about an episode of stillbirth. "Some weeks before she expected, owing to a fright. The fright was the cause of this child being born dead." And then Jane Austen, who's a wild beast, says, "I suppose she happened unawares to look at her husband." Boom! There goes the blow. And then she starts again with, "There has been a great deal of rain here for this last fortnight, much more than in Kent," and so on and so forth. This is an example of her intolerance for conventions, her unruly spirit, which finds its own reflections also in her fiction. A critic like Franco Moretti stresses the fact that a novel like Pride and Prejudice is very regular in its construction. It is almost predictable in its architecture. He calls it a very geometric novel based on a very geometric structure, very Austen-like, he says. I won't read the entire quotation, but there it is for you. But he also says that this regularity, this geometric clarity, is interfered with by what he calls fillers, details, like the detail of the gloves or the anecdotes of the lady giving birth to a dead child, and then the rain. So all of these details which bring into the novels something unpredictable. The flood of the everyday, apparently useless details, apparently inconsequential details, we could say. So, given all these complexities, an unruly author, very disobedient, very very unpredictable, novels that look extremely regular, extremely, as we say, as Moretti says, geometric. How do we read Jane Austen? From afar, from a distance, so look at the general structure, or from up close. Jane Austen's novels, Claire Harmon says, are tricky because they seem to present us always with the same type of plot. The love story, the simplified, streamlined monoplot. So man and woman meet, man and woman show some kind of interest, they are divided through various vicissitudes and obstacles or misunderstandings, and then in the end they come together. End of the story. This is what Moretti says when he talks about the geometric nature of Jane Austen's fiction. I suggest here today with you that if we concentrate on reading, we can possibly pierce through, find a way out of these impasses, of these difficulties. Maybe we can clear these hurdles. We can find a way of reading Austen more precisely, closer to the nature of her fiction, if, I suggest, we concentrate on reading in her novels. What I'm trying to say is that in her novels, and a novel like Pride and Prejudice, which we'll be working on in a second, Austen gives us clues as to how to read properly and as to how to read her novels properly. So what is the role, relevance of reading in Austen's fiction? There is always reading. There are always books in all of Jane Austen's novels. Even in the last one, Sanditon, the incomplete one, where at a certain point, the group of characters is led by this Mr. Parker to the lending library, a picture of which we saw in Christina's presentation, a visit to the library and to the library subscription book. And Charlotte, the protagonist, was glad to see as much and as quickly as possible where all was new. So this curiosity that books and reading always stimulate. The critic Gary Kelly, in a fundamental book about English fiction of the Romantic period, published back in 1989, but stuff because it's old, it doesn't mean that it's no longer good, as we know, being literary scholars, says that Austen uses novel reading in her novels, in particular, as a major metonymy for both discrimination in general and the problem of, oh dear, what did I write there? Mediating self and society. So discrimination in general, but also the problem between creating a link between the self, the individual, and society. So here already, Kelly tells us, gives us an idea as to why there is so much reading in Jane Austen's fiction. And he concentrates on one particular concept, discrimination or discriminating, which means looking at details, looking at particulars in order to, let's say, adopt a critical attitude towards a context, towards oneself. So when we talk about Austen, obviously, we have to refer to her art of the detail. In her letters, she very often refers to her particular eye for minutiae, so small things, little things. She also talks about her interest, her love for particulars. And then obviously we have that very famous quotation, which it comes from a letter to her nephew, James Edward Austen, who aspired to be a novelist, but in a very different way from his aunt's type of fiction. And she says, what should I do with your strong, manly, spirited sketches full of variety and glow? And she says, this is not the way I write. Because what she tends to do is to concentrate onto the little bit 2 inches wide of ivory on which I work with so fine a brush as produces little effect after much labor. So again, Austen is telling us in all of his letters that her art is an art of the detail, an art of the particular, and she's asking us to read details, to read carefully, to read with a very sharp eye. So let us apply some of these questions to Pride and Prejudice and focus on Elizabeth Bennet, who was one of Jane Austen's favourite characters. Jane Austen liked all of her heroines, also her heroes. She cared for them when she wrote them up, but obviously Elizabeth was her favourite. She wrote to her sister, I must confess that I think her, Elizabeth, as delightful a character as ever appeared in print. And how I shall be able to tolerate those who do not like her, at least, I do not know. Again, you see, sharp Austen, Austen as the wild beast who will be impatient with those readers who do dare not to like Elizabeth, Lizzie. Obviously, Lizzie, as we know, is an imperfect heroine. She's not a picture of perfection. Her prejudice, her excessive intellectual self-assurance, her need to learn how to read or interpret reality properly. And by reality, I mean her own feelings, others, other individuals, and society. Also, as we know, Elizabeth makes huge errors of judgment when it comes, for instance, to Mr. Darcy and Mr. Wickham. To summarize, we could say that Pride and Prejudice is a novel of manners and sentiment. It is also a novel about matrimonial plots. Two, at least. Well, there are more, of course, but there are two that are interesting, most interesting. It's a novel about social regulation, the achievement of social balance. It's also a novel that deals with growth, a process of growth, through discrimination and choice. And all of these aspects are centered on a very unconventional heroine, Elizabeth Bennet. She's unconventional already, and she shows it clearly, not just through her words, but through her body. In the 7th chapter of the 1st volume, where she decides to reach the house of Mr. Bingley, Netherfield, walking there on foot in order to visit her sister, who is unwell, and she decides to do so by walking there instead of taking the family's carriage, which is not available. She jumps over stiles, she springs over puddles, she is impatient, she's active, and at long last, she arrives within view of the house with weary ankles, dirty stockings, and a face glowing with the warmth of exercise. She's not following any of the rules by which a young lady should behave, should comport herself. When she walks into the drawing room, the breakfast parlour, and the men and the women are there, so Mr. Darcy, Bingley, Miss Bingley, Mrs. Hurst, the entire company, they are very surprised. She walked alone. She walked 3 miles. She walked by herself. Mr. Darcy is not merely surprised. He is also admired. Now, this unconventional heroine is also surprising because while the rest of the company in the drawing room are playing cards, and she's invited to join them, in actual fact, she prefers to pick up a book and start reading it. There is a very interesting dialogue that follows where Mr. Hurst, who's a very boorish, very, very vulgar man, says, "Do you prefer reading to cards?" said he. "That is rather singular." So basically he's saying you're wasting your time. Playing cards is much better. Miss Bingley, who is jealous, a competitor of Eliza Bennet, she has already declared war upon Lizzie, says, "Miss Eliza Bennet despises cards. She's a great reader and has no pleasure in anything else." Now, this conversation begins to turn on the idea, on the practice of reading. The discussion, but also the actions. Elizabeth picks up a book. Mr. Bingley offers to get her more books. And then he says, "I wish my collection were larger." The library at Netherfield is not extremely vast, let's say. Miss Bingley says, "I'm astonished that my father should have left so small a collection of books." This already is a signal that contains some interesting information. I'll tell you something about it later. And then she exclaims, addressing herself to Mr. Darcy, "What a delightful library you have at Pemberley, Mr. Darcy, so at your great house." And Darcy replies, "It ought to be good. It has been the work of many generations. And then you have added so much to it yourself. You're always buying books." And Darcy sort of terminates the conversation by saying, I cannot comprehend the neglect of a family library in such days as these. Now, notice how many things are being said thanks to books and about books. Now, first of all, we understand that Elizabeth is a reader. She needs to become a better reader, a better interpreter in the novel, but she is already, let's say, she has a bent for it. She's already inclined towards it. Then, look at the differences among the men. We have the vulgar man who doesn't consider reading a worthy activity. We have Mr. Darcy, who instead collects books. This already puts Darcy in a different light. Notice how books also underline the fact that not, let's say, the female characters are in competition, at least Miss Bingley and Elizabeth Bennet. So the idea of sorority, mutual support among women, is in doubt here. Then notice how the Bingleys and the Darcys are two families. The Bingleys are nouveau riche. They haven't had many generations of wealth behind them, and so there hasn't been an accumulation of a family library. Instead, Darcy comes from an ancient family of wealthy people who have created a family library. Two members of the same class, the same rank, we would say, the gentry, but belonging to, let's say, different family histories. And then we have that final remark, such days as these. How do we interpret this? Basically, if we look at the chronology that we can sort of understand from the novel, the events of Pride and Prejudice take place in the 1790s, in the revolutionary decade, after the outbreak of the French Revolution. So such days as these means very troubled times. A library is a sign of continuity, of tradition, of stability, and it can be an instrument to, let's say, oppose the instability of ideologically, politically troubled times like the present. If you keep reading this section of Pride and Prejudice, they keep talking about books. So all of these characters are studying each other. There are sort of interrelations of mutual likes and dislikes, and very often their interactions revolve around books. For instance, Miss Bingley, who is constantly trying to attract the notice of Mr. Darcy, she's trying to seduce him in a way, she has understood that he likes books, that he values books. And so at a certain point, she comes out, she's reading a book, although she would like to play cards, and she says, how pleasant, she's lying. She says, how pleasant it is to spend an evening in this way. I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading. How much sooner one tires of anything than of a book. When I have a house of my own, I shall be miserable if I have not an excellent library. She's saying, I would like to be mistress of Pemberley, Mr. Darcy, because you have an excellent library. Now, I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading. Now, ironically, Jane Austen gives these words to a character, Miss Bingley, who was making fun of reading and of Elizabeth being a reader only a few chapters before this one. This is one of the moments where you actually see Jane Austen's irony at work. Unfortunately, Jane Austen's irony bypasses readers. So sometimes she's so subtle that readers don't always get the irony. And unfortunately, this irony was not captured by the people at the Royal Mint, at the Bank of England, who created the new £10 note. If you notice, this banknote doesn't only have Jane Austen's Victorianized face and in the background the picture of a stately home that could be Pemberley, for instance, but there is also the quotation, "I declare after all there is no enjoyment like reading." Unfortunately, as we know, if we read Pride and Prejudice carefully, we know that these words are not spoken by a book lover, but by Miss Bingley, who is actually using reading and books in order to try and fascinate Mr. Darcy. Obviously, as we know, she fails because Mr. Darcy can see right through her and can see how false and deceitful she is. Books continue to emerge and re-emerge during the novel, and here we are in chapter 18 of volume 1. Now it is Darcy who tries to strike up a conversation with Elizabeth by talking about books. This is one of the things they've got in common. "What think you of books?" said he, smiling. Mr. Darcy smiles. This is very unusual. "Books," Lizzie says, "oh no, I'm sure we never read the same, or not with the same feelings." Notice how she says, we never read the same books or not with the same feelings. So she's saying we go in different directions. We are different readers. But then Darcy says, "I am sorry you think so. We may compare our different opinions." He is trying to build bridges. He is trying to connect with Elizabeth, and he is doing so by talking about books and reading. Elizabeth moves the conversation into a different direction. That is to say, she goes from talking about reading books to becoming a reader of Darcy. She begins to question him. She begins to put questions to him in order to try and understand his character, in order to try and read behind his rigidity, his inflexibility. For instance, she asks him about what he said once when he talked about his resentment, his hatred, his prejudice as well. Mr. Darcy answers, but then he says, "May I ask to what these questions tend?" And Elizabeth is very open, very honest. She says, "They tend to the illustration of your character. So I am trying to understand your character. I am trying to make it out." Notice this beautiful idiomatic expression, which was already in use in the early 1800s. "And what is your success?" "I do not get on at all. I hear such different accounts of you as puzzle me exceedingly." Puzzle is a very interesting word. I won't go into it because I'll be sort of moving towards my conclusions in a little while. But the word puzzle here means you confuse me. Let's say you create obstacles to my understanding. You're a very puzzling character. You're a very puzzling man. But also a puzzle, as we know, can be a game. And in Jane Austen, games are very important. Word games like riddles or charades, they are constantly present. There is a novel like Emma, where these, let's say, enigmas play a very central role. And again, they defy the character's ability to read reality, but also our own ability as readers to decode and interpret what we are seeing. Again, through puzzles, games, these questions and answers, Jane Austen is telling us that understanding through reading is a very complex process. And Mr. Darcy himself needs to become a better reader. He tries, but then he makes mistakes. And for instance, very famously, in chapter 11 of volume 2, he proposes to Elizabeth for the first time, but he completely misreads her. He talks to her about his sense of her inferiority, of the fact that her inferiority, her being from, let's say, an inferior level of the gentry, is a degradation. So he is degrading himself by allying himself and his family with her family. So there are family objects. These are all facts, but he loves us so much that he is ready to turn a blind eye to all of this. Elizabeth answers him with, let's say, firm coldness and with good manners, but at the same time, she feels offended and she rejects him. And here she explains why she has to say no. Well, it's very clear to us and to Elizabeth, but not to Darcy. Darcy has misread Elizabeth. He has misread, for instance, her attachment to her family, and she cannot tolerate that her family is spoken about in such terms. She's basically here telling Darcy, look, my friend, you have to start again from the beginning. You have to start learning how to read me and my family properly again from the start. You have to begin from scratch, and then we'll see. And then, as we know, things develop, the characters change, and Elizabeth herself begins to read correctly Mr. Darcy, and she begins to understand him. In chapter 8 of volume 3, we read, she began now to comprehend that he was exactly the man. So here we are at the end of this reading process, which we began with books and then moved on to reading people, reading men and women. And she understands that he will be the right man for her, not just because of the love that they could share, but also because, look at that, from his judgment, information, and knowledge of the world, she will be able to receive benefit of greater importance. So the greatest importance is attached to the possibility that Elizabeth will have to continue on this process of acquiring the skills of a sharp reader, thanks to the benefits that she will receive from Mr. Darcy's judgment, information, and knowledge of the world. She can continue to improve. She can continue to enlarge her ability to know reality and to interpret it, which basically asks one fundamental question. Are Jane Austen's novels primarily about love and the love plot? I'm not saying, but these words from, let's say, near the conclusion of Pride and Prejudice would lead us to believe something very different. Now, again, very briefly, two asides. In the novel, Mr. Bennet, Elizabeth's father, is very often in his library, in his office, we would say, in his study, with all of his books, and he reads, and we always see him reading also in the various film adaptations. Mr. Bennet may be a reader, but he is not a sharp reader, because he hasn't understood anything about his daughter. Her father was walking about the room looking grave and anxious. Lizzie, said he, what are you doing? Are you out of your senses? Are you mad to be accepting this man, Mr. Darcy? Have you not always hated him? By the end of the novel, Mr. Bennet, nice Mr. Bennet, understanding Mr. Bennet, hasn't understood a single thing about his daughter. Instead, Mrs. Bennet, at the beginning, is presented basically, we would say, as a silly woman, a superficial woman, a woman whose mind was not so difficult to unravel, to understand. She was a woman of mean understanding. So she could only understand so far and no more, and little information. But if you think about it, Mrs. Bennet has understood everything from the start, that her 5 daughters need to meet young men so that they need to enter society. They need to be mixed with society to find men, to find husbands, but also to develop experiences, to make their way into the world. By the end of the novel, Mrs. Bennet is not as surprised as Mr. Bennet that Elizabeth has fixed her, let's say, her sentiments to Mr. Darcy. Again, Jane Austen is very ironic here. What the narrator is saying about Mrs. Bennet here is definitely not the reality of facts, which means that we cannot always trust the voice of the narrator in Jane Austen's novels. So, approaching my conclusions, here we've got Keira Knightley as Elizabeth Bennet reading a book while walking around the countryside. So how can we sort of summarize some ideas about the meaning of reading in Austen? There are various ways in which, as you can read here in this slide, there are various ways in which we can say that Jane Austen was a real innovator of the novel. Catherine Sutherland even talks about her invention of the serious modern novel. She created conversational narratives that read like nothing her contemporaries produced. At the center, there is a growing heroine and hero who are inside a process of understanding their own selves and also developing their own situation, their position in society. So, yes, we have Austen giving importance to the inwardness of the heroine, to the development of subjectivity, but also we have Austen giving importance to a complex process of sighting, of situating of the individual inside society. So both interiority and exteriority. Reading is fundamental to both of these processes. Through reading, the characters develop their inwardness. They grow internally, psychologically, but they also grow externally. Reading books, reading people are crucial processes in order to understand society, understand others, and in order to sight oneself, to situate oneself in society. So to conclude, I will just go back to Gary Kelly and leave you with these words. Austen is a novelist of discrimination. Discrimination as not just a set of social codes and languages. That is to say, discrimination as a set of rules that divides vulgar people from elegant people, or well-mannered people from awful people. But discrimination as something more, the central practice of the self engaged in society. And at this point, I will conclude and thank you for your attention. And I will also try to get out of my presentation. Right. Okay. I am back. Christina, just a second. I will stop sharing. And here I am, I hope. Everything okay?
Hello, can you listen to me then?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I don't know if the rest of you. Okay, thank you so much. Well, thank you, Diego, for this illuminating conference, and thank you for unveiling the depths of Jane Austen's works. Okay, those who are watching us today think they are not going to read again Jane Austen the same way. Okay, thanks. Well, I have a question, or well, a several questions by Virginia Cole. Okay, I'm going to read it. It's quite long. It says, hello, Diego. I'm writing. Okay. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm here with 3 screens at the same time. I'll try to do it. No, it doesn't work with that. Okay, let's start. Hello, Diego. I'm writing my thesis on the reception of Jane Austen in Spain, and I found your presentation very helpful. I find that Austen and her works have 2 readings, images. As a reader, you can just look at the surface and you get a traditional love story. But if you look closer, you will find little by little these games and rebellions she stages as a woman. Do you find that this contemporary image of Austen as just a merely romance author diminishes her role as a great female author? Or is it more an opinion on romance as a genre not being considered important literature? This is the first question. And she also poses another one, okay?
Right.
She also says, do you think the screen adaptations have helped this portrayal?
Right. Okay. I'll. Oh, it's a lot of stuff, but thank you very much. I'll try to be as concise as I can. In general, not just in Britain, but also in other countries, when she started being translated, that Victorian image of Austen as the proper lady, pious, sweet, respectful of norms, has represented a huge limitation, I think, for the way she's been translated, presented in the introductions of these translations, and also read by critics until very, very recently. But there is a problem. Very often we continue to reprint old translations. So there is this kind of continuation of that kind of image. The screen adaptations, not all of them. No, I don't think that they have all uniformly reproduced that idea of Austen. There are some of them which are very subversive. That is to say, there are some of them that capture the disobedient element of Jane Austen. I will mention too Mansfield Park by Patricia Rozema and the latest Emma, the one that came out last year. Then, certainly, I do believe that that kind of roseate Victorian interpretation of Austen diminishes her as an author, diminishes her as an intellectual in particular. We have many recent works that actually, critical works, I mean, that actually reevaluate the depth of her readings, the depth of her conversation with the, let's say, not just the literature, but also the history, the philosophy of the time. Knox Shaw is one of those that comes to mind. Secondly, the question about romance is interesting. And possibly you may be onto something there. That is to say, when Austen was writing, she was writing very much in an anti-romance vein. She was, let's say, empowering the novel in her fiction, and she was keeping romance, the elements of the genre of the romance. I'm not talking about love story here. She was keeping it in the margins. What happens is that during the 19th century, she was decanonized and, let's say, she began to be read mostly as an author of romances. And that certainly hasn't helped. As you know, the genre of the romance has been reevaluated recently as an important complex genre. Final thing, reception of Jane Austen in Spain. The name of Victoria Alsina from Universitat Pompeu Fabra is the one that comes to mind with some important work on her translations at least. But I know that there's quite a lot more work out there already. So sorry if I've taken so long, but there were many questions and I've tried to be as concise as I could.
Perfect, Diego.
Thank you. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you so much. Well, I have a question, okay? This is because I told my students this morning that I was going to ask this question.
Good, so ask it.
You know, it's very easy. Okay, for someone who has not read Jane Austen previously, which is the novel that you will recommend to start with?
Right, okay, in general, so I'm talking to your students now.
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay.
You have to convince them.
Oh, goodness. Right. Okay. Well, I suppose that one easy way of saying it is what I said. Okay. One easy way to try and convincing them is what I said earlier. I said that Jane Austen is expecting readers to be clever readers, sharp readers, canny readers. So, in a way, she's challenging us. She's telling us, are you sharp enough to read me and understand me? And if I were someone who doesn't know Jane Austen, already I would feel that she's thrown the gauntlet at me. She has challenged me. So I want to prove that I can read Jane Austen and understand all the details. To me, that would be enough. But other reasons why reading Jane Austen is that if you're a male reader or a female reader, there is so much in these small worlds that she creates. There is a lot of comedy. She makes us smile and laugh, and we understand why we are smiling and laughing, and we learn stuff. There are also serious events and tragedies, especially if you're a young person in your 20s. All her characters are about that age. There are very few old people in her novels. They are really your contemporaries, your peers, and they face our problems, your problems, but our problems. How do I enter into a relationship with friends, with possible lovers? How do I relate to grown-ups? I have to shape my future. What do I have to learn? Which skills do I have to learn in order to shape my future? And then, of course, so these are not novels for anyone in particular. They're not novels for girls. They're not novels for boys. They're novels about life and how to face the challenges of life. Where to start? I would, and then also there are about a lot more. There are novels about that historical period. There are novels about the difficulties of women and how not, let's say, to get run over by society, but how to manage to fight your own fight in society. There are novels about lots and lots and lots of things. But I'll stop here. Where to start? I don't know. I started from Pride and Prejudice when I was at university. It was in a syllabus in the second year. I had no idea who she was. I had to read it, and it's one of those where I was obliged to read it, but I never thought, oh my goodness, why did I do it? Unlike other novels, and I won't mention which ones or other, never mind, because we have to like all of them, of course, professionally, Christine and myself and everybody else. So anyway, I would start from Pride and Prejudice because it's light, snappy, it's involving, it's fascinating. The characters are all extremely likable, even the dislikable ones. Another one which I would absolutely recommend, but it's very different, it's not as shining, is Persuasion. Mm-hmm. There again, you have, that's a little bit different because the protagonists are a little bit older. The woman, Anne, is 27. Just imagine, at 27, a woman had already had her chances. So just to give you an idea of what life was like at the time. But Anne is a great character because at 27, she says, no, I don't want to consider myself a loser. I want to try and fight again, knowing that reconquering the love of the man at that age was very, very difficult. So again, it's a novel about someone who doesn't want to be defeated. So these are strong novels. These are not monoplots about love, I guess. Christina, stop me. I could go on for hours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Diego.
Where would you start from? Would you also start from Pride and Prejudice, or would you start from, say, Sense and Sensibility, or
No,
Emma?
I'm also a Pride and Prejudice lover. I must admit, this is my favorite one.
Yeah, I've started liking Emma very much, because there again you have a character who looks perfect at the beginning, but she has to learn a lot because she's not, and she gets so many lessons in life that by the end of the novel you are on her side, definitely. So anyway, let's stop here.
Okay, thanks so much, Diego. So we have no more questions, so we can stop here.
Excellent.
Thanks,
thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Okay,
so we can have a short break now.
Perfect.
Break. Thanks.
See you soon. See you soon.
See you.